Good morning, church. Thank you, Stuart. My name is Gary Lepine. I am a member here at Bow Valley, and I have the privilege of sharing some words with you this morning. There is an old story about a very seasoned Sunday school teacher who had made it their life's mission to introduce children to Jesus at every opportunity. One day in class, the teacher began by saying, "Kids, I'm going to describe something to you, and I want you to tell me what you think it is. It's about yay big, brown, has a big furry tail, and gathers nuts that they store for the winter." One kid tentatively put his hand up and said, "I know the answer is Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me." Coming out of my neighborhood, the hill going down to 64th Ave, is a Moravian church that has an electronic sign where they regularly, and I give them credit for the creativity that they're trying to come up with the message periodically. And during this last holiday season, they just posted the question, "How does the weary world rejoice?" And my first thought was, I know the answer is Jesus, but... because there's so many but answers to that question. So all kinds of thoughts were going through my head. My first was, I wonder how other people see or are answering that question. That was my first thought. My other thought was just, I know I'm supposed to say Jesus, but it just seems like there's too many other answers that are pushing in on us. I don't know about you, I think it's a bad habit. No, it is a bad habit. So when my day consists of working primarily in my office, and you have the screens up and the browser history, and the one browser thing, they always do all the quick news titles. And if you read those, you'd come away thinking there is no answer to that question. The world is horrible. There's nothing good going on whatsoever. We might as well just let it burn, right? That's an answer. There's nothing worth rejoicing, period. That's an answer. Those are rough days when you start that way. Or there are more individualistic answers to that question, where a lot of people you talk to, myself included, it's easy to slip into this, where you just say, you know what? I don't think there is much hope for this world. I don't know if it could ever rejoice. I'm just going to get whatever I can get while the getting's good. Right? My job here is just to live the good life, whatever that means for me in this moment in time. I'll get what I can, and then everything else, hey, whatever happens, happens. Right? And there's lots of answers, and you know this. There's another answer that I call the James Bond answer. If you're a fan of James Bond movies, the plot is all basically the same, right? There is some evil person or organization led by a person who is bound and determined to destroy the world in some unique way, and James Bond's job is to stop them. And no matter how much he gets beat up, shot, whatever, he wins. That's the answer, right? And it's always, and I think we all secretly, maybe I secretly want to be James Bond, because there's always that scene, where he's in the elevator surrounded by bad guys or whatever, and his hands are tied, and somehow he escapes and beats them all up and conquers, and you go, yes, I want to be able to do that, right? It just seems cool. And there's so many movies where that's the plot. Some unassuming hero gets tired of the bad guys winning and beats them up, and establishes justice and peace, and we all rejoice, right? It's the same thing with bullies. How many clips do you see where it's the bully doing their thing, and finally someone stands up to the bully and beats them up, and life is good? And I get the appeal. I really do. There's a part of me that gravitates towards some of that. But the problem is, when I take a step back and look at all of that, it's just so not Jesus. I have been pondering a little bit how the first followers of Jesus would have answered the question, how does a weary world rejoice? Steve, over the last number of months, has been preaching on a series on being a beautiful presence. And I don't know about you, but lots of threads have been gathering as I've listened to him and pondered. And one of them, and I've always kind of wrestled with this. I think about first century believers and what it must have been like. Because, we can take a look at our world, and it definitely has its issues. But theirs was no walk in the park either. right? Like living as a believer in the first century would have been a rough call for a lot of it. I mean, Rome held absolute sway, and Rome was not an easy taskmaster. As long as you stayed off the radar, you probably did okay, but once they had you in their sights, life was not fun or pleasant. And they had little or no power or social status. And in lots of ways, and this is the fascinating part, and you can go back and read about all this, and Steve mentioned some of it, they were very odd. Not necessarily as individuals, but just their belief systems. Like the things they believed and they lived by just did not fit at all with the contemporary culture. They were very, very different. And most of them, obviously, when they first began, came out of a Jewish faith. Right? And so they had lots of expectations, and they actually had an answer to that question. See, their answer to the question, how can a weary world rejoice, from a Jewish perspective, was very clear. It was the Messiah. God's anointed, God's chosen person was going to come, right all wrongs, deal with all oppressors, including and especially Rome, reestablish the temple and the rule, and God's kingdom would come and rule here on earth. Kind of a James Bond answer, right? Because that's what they were expecting. And you can actually go back and read it, and there's lots, and we were looking for this. And actually, by the time Jesus showed up, there was almost a fervor of this expectation of the deliverer, the one who would come, God's chosen, who would finally deal with all this stuff and set us free and liberate us, and we could rejoice. And then Jesus shows up and doesn't do any of that stuff. He just doesn't. He disappoints them big time on so many levels because he takes the opposite approach. He doesn't conquer. He doesn't kick them out. He doesn't beat up the bully. And you're like, what gives? Like, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And the real, quote, turning point for them was that he died, because the Messiah was definitely not going to die, right? Like, that was not in the cards. Like, the Messiah was going to conquer, win, that was the deal. But Jesus up and dies. So pause for a minute. We just celebrated this. We just walked through this last weekend, right? And this is why Life After Easter, and Steve called this Easter Part 2, and that's really what I want to kind of spend some time on. But pause for just a second. When Jesus died, what the disciples and the followers and anyone who is even marginally curious about him must have felt. Like, the answer was simple. We backed the wrong guy. He's not the Messiah. God has not shown up. We are where we were, and all our hopes that we thought we were going to experience are no longer there. That's the reality. That's where they are. And then came Sunday. And Sunday changes everything. Big time. Back when I last spoke in February, I mentioned to you, kind of as a passing comment, but I'd already kind of started thinking about these thoughts. See, in the first century world, nobody believed in resurrection. Nobody really talked about it. It was not a thing. I mean, the Jewish faith had a concept that all of humanity, or parts of humanity, will raise at some point in the future at the end of it all. So that was part of their thinking. But for Romans and Greeks and others, this idea of a body resurrecting from the dead was just not a topic of conversation. It didn't happen. Like, they had ghosts and specters and spirits. They were very, very religious. They had amazingly intricate and fascinating ideas about the afterlife. I mean, so all of that was in play. But the concept, the idea that someone would literally rise from the dead mid-history, no. Nobody talked about that. And lo and behold, Jesus does it again, right? He wasn't supposed to die, and he definitely wasn't supposed to rise from the grave. And lo and behold, here he is. He does that as well. And that changes everything. Absolutely everything. It's interesting when you read the New Testament, we spend so much time around Christmas, right? Because Christmas is kind of the major. But the Bible spends very little time about the birth of Jesus. There's a couple of chapters and that's it. There is way more on the resurrection of Jesus That's the focal point of the story, because that's the thing that changed everything. Now, you could argue, obviously, if he wasn't born, he wouldn't be able to die and raise. So that does make some sense. But the reality is, it's the resurrection that is all the difference. And so when we answer this question, that is the answer to our question. When Jesus rose from the dead, everything changed. Whatever the future might hold, and this is where I think the first century believers kind of really gravitated. Whatever the future might hold, and the future was important to them, it really wasn't the primary issue. The future wasn't the issue. It was that the resurrection made this point, that this world, at this time, and all the people in it matter a great deal. Because Jesus is the Messiah. He did come and inaugurate God's kingdom. The answer was and is that Jesus was the answer, but not in the way the first century followers believed or anticipated. But it did empower them a great deal. It changed everything. Have you ever pondered this? We'll get into this, but the idea, because they're not spectacular, right? They're fishermen and all kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life. Like I said, they had no social power, and yet they revolutionized, they changed the world. You ever pause and wonder how that happened? Because they believed this. They believed this idea that someone rising from the dead, unheard of, unprecedented, changed everything. Because Jesus rose from the dead, a weary world can rejoice because there is an answer to the abuse of power that they were experiencing. Because death is the ultimate abuse of power, and it was conquered. The ultimate power of evil was no longer a factor because the ultimate evil, in so many ways, is death, and death was conquered. If you actually buy into that idea, believe that idea, what else matters? They faced all kinds of stuff because Jesus rose from the dead. So I have one point today. I'm going to have lots of layers on top of it, as you can imagine, but this is my one point. If you walk away with nothing else but this, here we go. When Jesus was raised from the dead, God's kingdom and his new creation had begun already. And because of this, we, his followers, have a job to do, a role to play. The first century believers believed this wholeheartedly. This is why they changed the world they lived in. The resurrection meant now mattered. So let's flesh this out a little bit. I'll be honest with you, there's a part of me that wishes this was not true. Right? It'd be a whole lot easier if this wasn't the case. I think there's a part of me that would feel easier if all I had to do was just hang in there. Just kind of white knuckle it until the end. Right? Just kind of keep your head down, not get too worried about stuff, not, just kind of let things happen, right? And just get to the end and made it. That's it. Wouldn't it? And in a moment of confession, I'll be honest with you, I think this is a very North American kind of approach because life is easier on some respects. It's easier to do that when you don't have to worry as much about what's going on around you and your own safety and stuff. A little bit different if your context is maybe a little bit more tenuous. And again, while the future is very important, don't hear me say otherwise. I know there is a whole future aspect to God's coming kingdom, no question. But the primary focus, that the future was already assured, God had already taken care of that, whatever it's going to look like. But the focus was the immediate implications of the resurrection. Now, what do we do with all of that? Now, there's a thread, I think, here that we need to add a layer, because there's a yeah, but in my head, and I'm guessing some of you already got there. It sure doesn't feel like that God's kingdom has come and that new creation is a reality, does it? That's those headlines again that come creeping in. But there's some parables that I think help us here. Now, if you're familiar with Jesus, obviously he loved speaking in parables. This was his thing. He was very rabbinic. He's a rabbi. He taught in parables. And there's lots of little nuances about it. So he had all kinds of parables about the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. And they're all given to just give a little layer or aspect of what the kingdom of heaven is like. These two are in the whole chapter of chapter 13 of Matthew. All the bigger ones are in there. These ones are just kind of tucked in. They're short, sweet, to the point. You know them, but they're incredibly powerful, and they reshape our world. Simply says this: he presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all other seeds, but when it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." He spoke another parable to them. "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened." You've probably heard these, you know where it's going, but there's some interesting thoughts that I think give a context to what the believers were wrestling with. See, the idea here, there's really 2 elements to this. The first is disproportionate results from what you would expect from the origin, right? Now, in fairness, like the first century Jews had no problem with a big kingdom. Like the results they expected. They expected God's kingdom to be all-encompassing, rule everything. That part was not an issue. The beginning part, though, this was not playing out. And that's what I've been talking about. Jesus, the Messiah, did not work out. See, Jesus is already starting to, again, plant the seeds. Sorry for the pun, but it does work, right? Plant that seed. It's kind of like, you're not getting it. I'm not James Bond. We're a mustard seed. We're leaven. We're different. And the main point, part of this, or the first main point of this parable, is he talks about, yes, the results are disproportionate. Very hard to see, but here's what's going to happen. Powerful stuff. Same thing with the leaven, and even the leaven is kind of an interesting twist. Any of you do the sourdough thing? Who's the sourdough bread people out of COVID? Come on, let's see a show of hands. How many of you got into this? Brent, come on, you said you were going to do it. You're not getting away with it. Yeah, we were talking about this. Because this is what you do. You have the starter thing, right? And then you kind of take that starter thing and you make a whole lot more out of it, right? Okay, well, this is kind of the idea of the leaven. This is what they would do. They'd take a little bit of leaven, and they would mix it. Now, what's fascinating, again, because they talk about that 3 pecks, and there's an amazing number of conversations about how much flour that actually is. I don't know, other than it's a lot. That's what we can all agree on. Exactly how much, we don't know. It's a lot. So again, the point of the parable is simply this. A little tiny thing has transformative influence on a large, unprecedented, disproportionate amount of stuff. There's also, just if you're curious, when it says that phrase, "and the birds of the air will come and nest in its branches." There's probably a nod to the book of Daniel in there, because there's a prophecy in Daniel about the coming kingdom, and that this is how it's described. So Jesus is probably quoting Daniel. The other part to this parable is that it's a question of time. See, it takes a significant amount of time for this little tiny mustard seed to become big. And it takes a significant amount of time for this leaven to transform the whole amount. And so the primary message of these 2 parables is simply this, that though hidden and hard to see, the kingdom of God is very much at work. Stanley Hauerwas has this quote that I quite like that I wanted to share with you. He says, "There's a kind of madness commensurate with being a disciple of Jesus. To see the world, to understand that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, requires people who refuse to be hurried. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed or yeast, because to be drawn into the kingdom of heaven is to participate in God's patience toward his creation. Jesus is teaching us to see the significance in the insignificant." So my real title for this message is this: Life After Easter, the Mundane Kingdom, the Insignificant Kingdom, the Hidden, the Unseen. Now let me pause for just a second. A lifetime ago, when I was significantly younger and even more stupid than I am today, I was invited to preach at Vulcan Church of Christ, small rural church south of here. And I was kind of working through the book of Amos. I like the 8th century prophets. And so I was speaking on Amos, and part of why I like the 8th century prophets is because they are just, quote, nobodies. They are just, like most of them, they come from, we don't know anything about them. God just picked somebody, they showed up, they said yes. It's fascinating to me that just, like there's no power, there's no standing, there's no social status. God seems to delight in just picking people at random and say, you're it, and away you go. And I was trying to emphasize and say this point. So I was saying, like the prophets, like they're nobodies, like farmers. Yeah. And they all laughed, and I didn't realize why they were laughing because I wasn't connecting. Again, sometimes words leave my mouth long before there's any processing going on whatsoever. Amen. Yeah. So for any of you who have experienced that side of me, my deepest and sincerest apologies. It's not usually intentional, although sometimes it might be. But the reality is just, so I'm going to try this again many years later, and hopefully not insult all of you. But here is very much my point. Yes, some, and maybe some in this gathering, you're called to do something big, huge, public, absolutely, and that's fantastic. But my experience has been most of us, that's not our lives, right? Like our lives are our lives. They're just what's in front of us. We just do what we do. It's the mundane life that we live. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there aren't exciting things and important things. I guess what I'm trying to get at is exactly what Harawa said. I'm trying to get that the heart of the kingdom is seeing the significance in the insignificant. Let me try to illustrate this a little bit. Just some thoughts. I was trying to figure out if I could see some of this. Here are just a few. One was a story. I remember listening to a guy talk about just an event in his life. It was when his father passed away. And so a friend of his, they were in high school, and his high school buddy wanted to come to the funeral. And he came to the funeral, and the church was packed. There's over 1,000 people in this funeral celebrating this man's life. And the friend just looked at the guy who was telling the story and said, "Who was your dad?" And he said, "He was the caretaker at the local school." And the guy said, "I don't get it." He said, "He was just the caretaker. But he touched so many lives, and he did it in such a genuine way, and he was just a person of faith, and this is the impact." And the person just looks at, "That's what I want. I want that." Let me share a little bit more personal story. Some of you know this. Most of you will not, but here we go. The home I grew up in was very humble. The Lepine family was a very blue-collar, rural backgrounds, humble, southeast Edmonton. I took my kids by the house we grew up in. They can't believe that's the house I grew up in. The house I grew up in, I'm guessing on 3 floors, maybe 1,000 square feet. I mean, my house that I live in now is significantly bigger than that house. I mean, 1920s, pre-wartime house, like that's the house. My parents had 6 kids that they raised in this house. They also had a foster home. So literally over 25 years, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people came and went through this house. Okay? I used to tell people we were the original Tim Hortons. Coffee was always on. Truly, it got started in the morning. It was there right through the day. I don't know if it was any good. I'm not a coffee drinker. I have no idea. But it was always on. Like, people came and went all the time. My parents never locked our doors. Now, there's, kind of a culture thing to it, that kind of thing. But my mom's theory was if you could get past the dogs, you're probably okay. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up and there's someone sleeping on the couch. This is my house. And if you showed up at dinner time, you just grabbed a plate, found a place to sit, and that was it. Like, it was an odd existence. I didn't realize how odd it was until I went and visited friends, right? And I realized, whoa, you live very differently than I do. The wrinkle to the story is I was not born into that family. I was adopted. Again, a long time ago, my biological mother did not live in Edmonton. This was back when you came and actually spent a few days in hospital when you were going to deliver, right? And she came in and she needed a place to stay. She just somehow ended up at Dr. Raynham's office, who happened to be the family doctor of Ruth and Louis Lepine. And she said, I need a place to stay. And he said, well, if you go see Ruth and Louis Lepine, they take people in, see what they can do. And she literally knocked on the door and said, Dr. Raynham said you might have a bed for me. And I said, yeah, I mean, you can sleep on the couch if you want, no problem. And she did that, went, delivered, and through a variety of reasons, made the decision that she was unable to raise her newborn son, and made the decision to allow the Lepines to raise me. So I am here, my story started, and I am here simply because Ruth and Louis Lepine let a stranger sleep on their couch for a night. So it's inbred where you just kind of realize that, and the funny part is, like, if you talk to, like, my dad passed away when I was in high school. I remember listening to Mom. We were doing a church thing on spiritual gifts. Do you remember all that when that was a thing, right? The whole spiritual gift inventory and the whole bit. And I remember sitting beside my mom in church and said, I don't have any spiritual gifts. And someone looked at her and said, you have the most amazing, I mean, it's just sheer hospitality, right? She just made everyone feel comfortable. There's nothing, take this the right way. My mom would say there's nothing special about her. She was just her. This is the insignificant kingdom. One more story and then some closing thoughts. A friend of mine works in sales. And part of his salary, as you know, is commission. You know this, right? And it's kind of a combination. And commissions are a little bit convoluted, right? Because there's a number of people involved in getting a contract and fulfilling it and all those kinds of things. So they break it up to see who gets what part of the commission. And sometimes it's totally the salesperson, and sometimes it gets shared and all that. So anyways, this sale happened. My friend reported it, but made an error in how it was reported. And so they ended up splitting. He got part of the commission, and this other person got it. But I can't remember the whole detail, but there's an error was made, and it got caught. And his boss called him in, and when he thought, okay, so let's have a conversation, figure out what happened, and away we go. But his boss is there, but also HR. Yeah, and he's kind of sitting there with HR, and he starts to realize this is a much bigger deal. Like they're not thinking an error was made. They're thinking you're trying to scam the system. Like you deliberately tried to get away with something. And so as the conversation goes along, they just simply said, well, how do you suggest we fix this? And my friend just looked and said, well, give the other person the entire commission. And they looked at him and said, what do you mean? Well, just give them the entire commission. I made a mistake. It's not their fault. I'm the one, so just give it all to them. That's the easiest, best way to fix this. And that's what they did, but he said they spent the next 2 hours grilling him because they were convinced that there was still an angle here. You're gaming the system somehow. And his response was just, this is just the right thing to do. Because as a person of Jesus, this is what you do. But they couldn't get it. So my point is just simply this, that there can be something truly remarkable in the unremarkable. That details matter a great deal. That there can be significant in the insignificant. And I wonder if a lot of us, I'm hoping that you're kind of resonating with that because, again, some of you may be called to tremendous acts of faith that are very public, that change the world. That would be fantastic. But my experience is God doesn't work that way primarily. He calls all of us to just do your thing, live your life, be faithful where you are. So, all of this is simply to say this. A weary world, I think, can rejoice simply because there is hope. And biblical hope is not wishful thinking, as we often use the term, but biblical hope is founded on the character and action and promises of God that he declared loud and clear when Jesus rose from the dead. God's kingdom has begun, and new creation is happening all around us, even if we're unable to see it all the time. A weary world can rejoice when followers of Jesus simply try to live their lives according to the values that he taught. values that build God's kingdom in his way, that help bring about God's new creation. In a world, I think, that where we are surrounded by others and more connected by gadgets than ever before, right? In technology, we are more connected than ever before, and yet loneliness is the number one complaint that you hear from people. So maybe a weary world can rejoice when a community of people practices fellowship and friendship and hospitality. A weary world can rejoice because knowing that this is God's world, it is his kingdom, and he ultimately rules over it. And followers, therefore, can live generously and respond to the needs of others that we see in this life. I think a weary world can rejoice because as a community of believers, we can respond to the many abuses of power that we see and experience in our world, not with additional violence or force, but with love and service and graciousness and kindness. The Jesus way. I think a weary world can rejoice when we, the followers of Jesus, shine in our mundane, day-to-day lives.